The Texas highways at night have a way of making you feel like the only person left in the world. The road stretches endlessly into the dark. The stars above seem unnervingly distant, and the only sound is the low hum of an engine cutting through the silence. For Officer James, nights like these had become second nature after nearly a decade on the force. He had seen all kinds of things: wrecks, drunks, the occasional stranded motorist in need of a tow, but nothing had prepared him for the night he met the hitchhiker. It was just past 2 in the morning when he spotted her, a lone figure on the side of the road, standing eerily still in the glow of his headlights. She was young, early 20s maybe, wearing a light-colored dress that clung to her in the heavy rain. Her hair was soaked, plastered to her pale skin, and she stood there with an unsettling stillness, as if she hadn't just been caught in the middle of a storm. James slowed his patrol car and pulled onto the shoulder, keeping his lights on. He had dealt with lost travelers before, sometimes kids running away from home, sometimes victims of a broken-down car. He stepped out, the rain hitting his uniform in sharp, cold pinpricks. "Ma'am, do you need help?" His voice was calm, professional, but something about the way she slowly turned her head toward him made his stomach tighten. Her eyes were deep, hollow, almost vacant. She didn't seem afraid or relieved to see him. She didn't even seem surprised. Instead, she raised one hand, a slow, deliberate movement, and pointed down the road. James hesitated. Normally, this was the part where someone would start talking. They would explain what happened, why they were out here in the middle of nowhere, at this hour. But she said nothing, just stood there, rainwater dripping from her fingertips, her face void of emotion. Against every instinct in his body, he opened the back door. "Come on in. I'll take you somewhere safe," he said, gesturing for her to sit. She moved with the same slow precision, stepping into the car without a word. As soon as she was inside, James felt a weight settle in his chest, an inexplicable, suffocating pressure that made it harder to breathe. He shook it off and got back, behind the wheel. As he pulled back onto the road, he reached for his radio. "Dispatch, I've got a possible stranded pedestrian, white female, early 20s. Can you check for any missing persons reports in the area?" The radio crackled in response. "Copy that. Stand by." James glanced at the rearview mirror to check on his passenger. She was sitting completely still, her hands resting in her lap, her head tilted slightly downward. Rainwater pooled beneath her feet, but other than that, she made no movement. No attempt to wring out her clothes, no shivering from the cold. The longer he drove, the heavier the air in the car seemed to become. It wasn't just her silence, it was something else, something intangible that gnawed at the edges of his nerves. He had transported plenty of people in the back of his car before, but never had he felt this kind of pressure, this sense of unease so thick it made his hands grip. The wheel a little tighter. Then dispatch came back over the radio. "Negative on missing persons. No reports matching that description in the last week. You sure about the details?" James furrowed his brow. That didn't make sense. Someone like her, young, alone, caught in the storm. Surely someone would have reported her missing. He flicked his gaze back to the mirror. She was gone. The seat was empty, dry, completely untouched. James slammed the brakes, his heart pounding against his ribs. He turned, fully expecting to see the back door open, rain rushing in. But it was closed, locked. He twisted around in his seat, searching the darkness outside, his headlights illuminating nothing but an empty road and sheets of falling rain. His breathing was heavy, uneven. His mind raced for explanations. Maybe she had somehow slipped out when he wasn't looking, but that didn't make sense. He would have heard the door. The car hadn't stopped. And the seat? There wasn't a single trace of water left behind. He sat there for what felt like an eternity, staring into the rearview mirror, half expecting her to reappear. But she didn't. Shaken, he reached for his radio again. "Dispatch, disregard my last call." Must have been a false report. His voice was steady, but his hands felt ice cold against the wheel. He drove the rest of his shift in silence, every so often checking the back seat, half convinced he would see her again. But the car remained empty. 2 days later, still haunted by the encounter, he mentioned it to an older officer, one who had been patrolling these roads long before James had joined the force. He told the story, expecting to be met with skepticism, maybe even laughter. Instead, the older man's face went pale. "You saw her." James frowned. "Who?" The veteran officer leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. "About 20 years ago, a young woman died in a crash along that stretch of road. Her car went off into a ditch. Driver never stopped to help her. By the time someone found her, it was too late." James felt his stomach drop. "They say she still wanders that highway." The man continued, his voice quiet, almost distant. "People see her on rainy nights. She gets in their car, but she never makes it to her destination." James didn't believe in ghosts, at least not before that night. But he never drove that highway alone again, and he never, ever stopped for hitchhikers. In the rain, Officer Ramirez had always thought of himself as a man of reason. Logic, training, and experience shaped his worldview, leaving little room for superstition. He had spent over a decade in law enforcement, responding to everything from violent crimes to routine welfare checks. But of all the calls he had answered, there was one that stayed with him, one that made him question the very fabric of reality. It was just before midnight when the dispatcher's voice crackled through his radio. A woman had called in, reporting strange noises coming from her attic. She lived alone in a modest house on the outskirts of town and was convinced that someone, or something, was up there. She spoke in hushed tones, her voice trembling as she explained that she had heard whispers, faint but distinct, coming from the ceiling above her bedroom. Ramirez had handled enough cases to know that most of these calls had logical explanations. It was likely just an animal, maybe a raccoon or an opossum that had found its way inside. Sometimes houses made noise, pipes shifting, old wood settling. People let their imaginations run wild, especially when they were alone at night. Still, he radioed in his arrival as he pulled into the woman's driveway. The house was small, old but well kept, its porch light flickering against the thick darkness beyond. He knocked on the door, and almost immediately, it creaked open. A woman in her 60s stood there, wrapped in a faded robe, her eyes wide, with exhaustion and fear. "I swear it's real," she said before he could even introduce himself. "I hear it every night. Whispers, footsteps." Her hands shook as she gripped the edge of the door, and Ramirez felt a pang of sympathy. Whether or not there was anything in the attic, she was genuinely terrified. He gave her a reassuring nod. "I'll check it out," he said, stepping inside. The house smelled of lavender and old books, a combination that should have been comforting but instead felt strangely oppressive. Ramirez glanced around. Everything was neat, too neat, as if the woman rarely disturbed anything beyond her immediate living space. A single chair was positioned in front of the television, a blanket folded carefully over the armrest. The kitchen, light flickered slightly, casting shadows that seemed to stretch too far along the walls. He gestured toward the attic entrance. "Where's the access?" She pointed toward the hallway. A thin rope dangled from the ceiling, the kind attached to a pull-down ladder. It swayed slightly, as if someone had just let go of it. Ramirez narrowed his eyes. "Did you open it before I got here?" The woman shook her head. I don't go near it, I don't even look at it. He reached up and pulled the cord. The ladder unfolded with a groan, the wooden steps creaking under their own weight. A thick wave of dust rained down, catching the dim light. Ramirez stepped back, shining his flashlight into the darkness above. The attic was small, just large enough for storage, with exposed wooden beams crisscrossing beneath the low ceiling. He climbed up cautiously, his boots heavy against the aged wood. The air was thick and stale, carrying the unmistakable scent of something long undisturbed. He swept the flashlight across the space. No signs of forced entry, no scattered insulation or animal droppings, just dust-covered boxes, an old rocking chair, and he froze. The chair was moving. It was slight, almost imperceptible, but the wooden chair was swaying, as if someone had just risen from it. Ramirez swallowed, stepping closer. He told himself it was just the air shifting from his movement, that maybe the foundation of the house was unstable. But then he heard it, a whisper. Low, hushed, but undeniably there. His skin prickled as he turned, scanning the darkness. The whispering didn't stop. It didn't grow louder, didn't fade, just remained at a constant, breathy murmur, surrounding him from all directions. He steadied himself, forcing logic back into his mind. A vent, maybe. Some kind of old ductwork carrying sounds from another part of the house. But the whispering was clear. It wasn't the distant mutter of a television or the wind slipping through cracks in the wood. It was a voice, and it was speaking. To him. Get out. His breath caught in his throat. The words weren't shouted, they weren't a plea or a warning. They were calm, certain. He didn't hesitate. In one swift motion, he turned and climbed down the attic ladder, landing back in the hallway faster than he thought possible. He pulled the cord, slamming the attic door shut. The woman stood at the end of the hall, her eyes searching his face for answers. His mouth felt dry as he tried to steady his voice. "No one's up there," she exhaled, the kind of breath that carried years of exhaustion. "I know," she whispered, "but it doesn't matter, does it?" Ramirez didn't respond. He couldn't. Instead, he advised her to stay elsewhere for the night and assured her he'd file a report. But as he stepped outside, back into the cool night air, he realized his hands were shaking. 2 days later, unable to shake the experience, he looked up the house's history. It had belonged to a man named Richard Connors, a recluse, someone who had reportedly kept to himself. Decades ago, neighbors had begun noticing his absence. No one had seen him leave. No one had seen him at all. Eventually, the police were called to investigate. They found him in the attic, hanging from the rafters. The rocking chair beneath him still swayed when they arrived. Ramirez closed his laptop. He had dealt with plenty of unsettling cases in his career, but this one stayed with him. He never spoke about it at the station, never told anyone what he had heard up there in that attic. But some nights, when the air was too still and the silence too deep, he swore he could still hear it, that whisper threading through the darkness, a voice that never left him. Officer Daniels had always trusted his instincts. After spending 15 years patrolling the back roads of North Carolina, he had learned to read a situation before it even unfolded. He knew when someone was lying. He could sense when a routine traffic stop was about to turn dangerous. And he had developed a kind of internal clock that told him when it was time to move on, to get out of a place before something went wrong. But none of those instincts helped him on the night he first saw the man in his rearview mirror. It was late, past 2 in the morning, and Daniels had been driving a long stretch of highway that cut through dense pine forest on both sides. It was a road he knew well, a place where the darkness always seemed just a little heavier than it should be. He had pulled into a clearing just off the shoulder to take a short break, a habit he had developed over the years. These quiet moments, alone in the night with nothing but the low hum of the engine and the rustling of trees, were oddly peaceful. He leaned back in his seat, letting out a slow breath as he took a sip of his coffee. The night was uneventful, just the way he liked it. No calls, no drunks swerving across the lanes, no domestic disputes spilling out onto front lawns. Just silence. He had learned to appreciate these moments. They were rare. That was when he saw the movement in his rearview mirror. It was subtle, barely noticeable at first, just the faintest flicker of motion behind his car. He straightened, setting his coffee down as he adjusted the mirror for a clearer view. At first, he thought maybe it was a trick of the light, the way the trees swayed in the wind. But then he saw it. A man, standing directly behind his vehicle, just at the edge of the red glow from his taillights. Daniels felt his pulse quicken. He hadn't heard anyone approach. The clearing was wide, and he would have seen headlights or heard footsteps on the gravel. But the man was just there, still watching. His training kicked in immediately. He reached for his flashlight with one hand and his radio with the other. He didn't call it in yet. He wasn't the type to overreact, but he kept his voice steady as he stepped out of the car. "Sir, do you need assistance?" No response. The man didn't move, didn't shift his weight, didn't even seem to register that Daniels had spoken. That was when he noticed something else. The man's clothing was outdated, like something out of an old police uniform. Not a modern one, something from decades ago. A heavy, dark jacket, tall boots, a duty belt. His posture was rigid, almost military-like. Daniels tightened his grip on the flashlight and stepped forward. "Sir?" Still nothing. He shined the beam directly at him. The man was gone, not like he had stepped back into the trees, not like he had turned and walked away. He was just gone, as if he had never been there at all. Daniels swung the light around, scanning the area, his heartbeat drumming in his ears. There was nowhere to hide, no movement, just the wind whispering through the branches. He took another step forward, listening for anything. Breathing, footsteps, the crunch of leaves. Silence. Swallowing hard, he walked back to his cruiser, telling himself he had imagined it. Maybe he was just tired. Maybe it had been a shadow. A weird reflection, something logical. But then came the knock, a deep, hollow tap against the driver's side window. Daniels whipped around, his pulse spiking. There was no one there. The glass was fogged slightly from the temperature shift, but no handprints. No sign that anyone had touched it. His hands were ice cold now. He got into the car, locking the doors out of instinct, and took a steadying breath. He reached for his radio, hesitating for a brief second before pressing the button. "Dispatch, this is Unit 14. I need a status check. Any reports of pedestrians on Highway 17 near mile marker 82? A few seconds passed before the response came through. "-14, no reports, you need backup?" Daniels exhaled. "Negative, just checking." He put the car in drive and pulled back onto the road, forcing himself to shake off the feeling of unease. But as he glanced at his rearview mirror one last time, he saw something that made his stomach drop. There, in the dim reflection, just for a split second, was the man, sitting in his back seat. Then, he was gone. Daniel slammed the brakes, his heart hammering so hard he thought it might break through his ribs. He turned around, half expecting to see the impossible, but the seat was empty. He sat there, gripping the steering wheel, trying to make sense of what had just happened. He had never been the type to believe in ghosts. He was a man of facts, of logic, of things he could explain. But this defied all of that. He drove straight back to the station that night, not stopping once. He didn't tell anyone what had happened. Not yet. It wasn't until a few nights later, when he was sitting in the break room with another officer, a veteran of the force, someone who had worked these roads long before Daniels, that he finally, Mentioned it. Have you ever seen anything weird on Highway 17? The older officer looked up from his coffee, his expression unreadable. Why do you ask? Daniels hesitated, then recounted the story, leaving nothing out. When he finished, the room was silent. The veteran officer set his cup down, exhaling. Slowly, "You saw him," he said quietly. Daniels frowned. "Saw who?" The man leaned back in his chair, rubbing a hand over his face. There used to be a state trooper assigned to that stretch of highway, back in the 80s. Good man. Everyone liked. Then one night, some drunk idiot came flying around a curve, hit him while he was out assisting a motorist. Killed him instantly. Driver didn't even stop. Daniels felt his stomach twist. Some folks say he never really left, that he still watches over that road, checking on officers, making sure they're safe. The veteran officer gave him a pointed look. But the ones who see him, they only ever see him once. Daniels sat back, his mind spinning. He wanted to dismiss it, to laugh it off, to chalk it up to exhaustion or stress. But he couldn't shake the feeling that what he had seen that night was real. He never spoke about it again. But he also never pulled over on that stretch of road after dark. And for the rest of his career, every time he glanced at his rear view mirror, he half expected to see a man sitting in his back seat waiting, watching. But he never did. Because just like the veteran officer had said, you only ever see him once. Officer Thompson had spent years on the force, long enough to have seen the worst humanity had to offer. He had worked homicides, missing persons cases, domestic violence calls that left his stomach in knots. But despite everything, he had never been a man who scared easily. Fear was something he had learned to control, to compartmentalize. It was a tool, nothing more. At least, that's what he believed before the night the woods tried to keep him. It started with a simple call, a missing hiker. A young man, early 20s, had failed to return home after heading into the woods just outside of Huntsville, Alabama. The call came in late, just past 9 in the evening. And by the time Thompson arrived at the trailhead, the sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving only a sliver of fading light along the treetops. The search party was small, just him, 2 other officers, and a park ranger who knew the area better than any of them. The ranger led the way, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. "Most people don't get lost out here unless they're real unlucky," he said, his voice low and even. "But sometimes the woods just don't let you out." Thompson had chuckled at that, shaking his head. "You mean they get turned around?" The ranger didn't smile. "I mean what I said." They moved deeper into the forest, calling out the hiker's name. The trees swallowed the sound, absorbing their voices before they had a chance to carry. The further they walked, the more the air seemed to change, thicker, heavier. It wasn't just the usual humidity that came with Alabama summers. It was something else, a pressure, a weight that settled over Thompson's shoulders. 30 minutes passed, then an hour. No sign of the kid, no footprints, no broken branches. Nothing. It was as if he had never been there at all. Then Thompson's radio crackled, a burst of static, then silence. He tried again. "Dispatch, this is Officer Thompson. Do you copy?" Nothing. He exchanged a glance with the others. The ranger frowned. Shouldn't be losing signal here. But they had. And that was when Thompson realized something else. The forest was too quiet. No insects, no birds, not even the rustling of small animals in the underbrush. Just stillness. That was when they heard the first sound. A laugh. Distant, barely above a whisper, but unmistakably human. It echoed between the trees, bouncing from different directions, making it impossible to tell where it had come from. Thompson swung his flashlight around, scanning the darkness. "Hello, this is the police. If you need help, call out." Silence. The other officers exchanged uneasy glances. The ranger muttered something under his breath. They pressed on, the laughter still lingering at the edges of their hearing. Then finally, they saw something. A flicker of movement between the trees. A shadow, too tall and thin to be the missing hiker. It disappeared almost as soon as it appeared, but it was enough to put Thompson on edge. They followed. The deeper they went, the worse the feeling in Thompson's gut became. He was no stranger to bad situations, to the kind of danger that made the hairs on his arms stand on end. But this was different. This wasn't the feeling of walking into an armed standoff or chasing down a suspect. This was something primal. The kind of fear that sat deep in your bones, whispering that you had made a mistake. They came upon a small clearing, and at the center stood an old, crumbling fire pit. Around it were footprints, fresh, circling the pit in chaotic patterns. But they weren't boot prints. They were barefoot, and there were dozens of them. Something was wrong. Thompson turned to the ranger. "What the hell is this?" The man's face was pale, his flashlight shaking slightly. "We need to leave." Before Thompson could respond, the laughter turned, closer this time, more distinct. And then came the whispers, low, murmuring voices, threading through the trees like wind through dead leaves. He couldn't make out the words, but they surrounded them, shifting from one place to another, always just beyond his vision. And then, the footsteps, not theirs, others, moving through the brush, circling them, coming from every direction Once Thompson drew his weapon. "Show yourselves!" Silence. His flashlight caught something just beyond the trees, a figure standing impossibly still. The light barely touched it, but it was there, a shape darker than the surrounding night. Watching, and then it moved. Not the way a person moves. Not the way anything human moves. It was sudden, jerking, wrong. It was there 1 second, then it was gone, as if the forest had swallowed it whole. The ranger grabbed Thompson's arm. "Now, we go now." They didn't run. Running felt wrong. Felt like the kind of thing that would make whatever was out there chase them. But they walked fast. Faster than they should have been able to with how deep they were. And yet somehow, they made it back to the trailhead in minutes. That was the part that never made sense. They had walked for hours, but returning to the entrance had taken less than 5 minutes. As if the woods had finally decided to spit them out. The missing hiker was never found. Thompson never went back into those woods. Neither did the other officers who had been with him. And the ranger? He quit a month later, moved out of state. Years later, Thompson still dreams about that night. The laughter, the whispers, the feeling of being watched by something that wasn't supposed to exist. And he still wonders what would have happened if the woods had decided not to let them leave. The stories we've explored, of lost souls on dark highways, unseen forces in abandoned attics, ghostly figures in rearview mirrors, and the sinister pull of the woods, are more than just chilling encounters. They force us to confront a question we often push aside. How much of the world do we truly understand? These officers, trained to rely on logic, evidence, and reason, found themselves in situations where those tools failed them. They experienced something beyond their control, something that left them questioning the very fabric of reality. And perhaps there's a lesson in that. Fear is often seen as a weakness, something to be overcome or ignored. But fear, in its purest form, is a warning. It tells us when something isn't right, when we've stepped too close to the edge of the unknown. Officer Thompson knew that the woods felt wrong long before anything happened. Officer Ramirez felt the heavy, suffocating silence in the attic before he ever heard the whisper. Officer Daniels sensed an unnatural presence before the ghost in the rearview mirror appeared. Their instincts, honed from years on the job, picked up on something before their minds could process it. That isn't superstition. That's survival. Maybe. The takeaway from these stories isn't to fear the supernatural, but rather to respect the unknown. There are things in this world that can't be neatly categorized or rationalized, things that don't fit into police reports or scientific explanations. Some places hold energy from the past, echoes of tragedies that refuse to fade. Some roads carry the memories of those who never made it home. And some forests, no matter how many maps exist, will never truly belong to us. But beyond the supernatural elements, there's another message hidden in these tales, one that speaks to something deeply human. Each of these officers entered these situations believing in their own control, their own authority over the moment. They were trained professionals, men who had faced the worst of human nature, and yet in these encounters they were powerless. No badge, no weapon, no years of experience could explain what they saw or protect them from the overwhelming sense of helplessness. It's a humbling reminder that no matter how much we think we know, there are forces greater than us. Forces that remind us of our own fragility, our own mortality. And maybe that's not something to fear, but something to learn from, to walk through life with a little more humility, to listen to the things we often dismiss, to trust the instincts that whisper to us when something isn't right. At the end of the day, these stories don't just ask whether ghosts are real. They ask whether we are willing to see what's right in front of us, whether we have the courage to acknowledge that the world is far stranger than we allow ourselves to believe. And if we ever find ourselves alone on a deserted road, staring into a darkened forest, or feeling a presence in an empty house, maybe the best thing we can do is what these officers eventually did: listen and leave.